Good evening. Welcome to Street Talk. Father Russ, unfortunately, is still out in the New London area, working away. So we're producing some more shows down here at Seymour in the interim, and we have some interesting educational information on an issue that's very pertinent to my life. Today, we're here to discuss rare diseases. And with me, I have Lesley Bennet, who's NORD's volunteer ambassador to the state of Connecticut. Welcome, Lesley. And I have Mary Dunkle, who is the educational director for the National Organization of Rare Diseases, which I come to find out is actually based here in Connecticut. It's based up in Danbury. So I wanted to welcome you here.
Thank you, Dominic.
I know we're kind of trying to do this ahead of time to get out the word to people, to let them know that National Rare Disease Day is actually on February 28th, and this year, as we do on every year on that date, we actually have a large group of people that come up to Hartford, the state's capital, on that morning, and we make a presentation to our state legislators so they can have a face and a better understanding of what our needs and issues are, and what our focus is. And I wanted to get some experts on here. I know I've talked about this with Father Russ before, because this is such a confusing topic. It's confusing for people to understand, I guess, how prevalent it is, and what it really means to somebody when they get diagnosed. So I guess probably the easiest way to start out here is, what are some of the numbers? Because you say a rare disease, and it makes it sound like, okay, well, there's only like 3 or 4 people that have this, but that's not the case. So how many people do rare diseases affect, and how many rare diseases are there?
So, Dominic, that's actually a really good point. When you say the word rare, a lot of times people think, oh, that doesn't apply to me, that's for somebody else. But in fact, everybody knows someone with a rare disease. There are about 7,000 diseases considered rare in the U.S., affecting about 30 million Americans. So that's almost 1 in 10 people. So every single one of us has a relative or a friend who's affected by a rare disease.
Now, when we talk about some of these diseases or disorders, I know some of them have more catastrophic effects on a person's health. And some of them may be more, undiagnosed or not knowing exactly what's going on, but might not have a really, detrimental effect on somebody. But when I think of rare diseases, and I know that we were talking about it before, there are a lot of fundraisers, and through the rare disease community, I've met other families that have had them. So when we think about this, I mean, this touches so many people's lives, and you really get a better understanding of that when you see a community come together. And I know our state's about 3.5 million, so there's about 350,000 people that are directly affected, and then probably about a lot more that are indirectly.
More than half of them are children.
Yeah.
So you have to figure that families are affected. And it's the family, and it becomes the community. These children go to school, and you will have an entire community affected. So it becomes a huge financial, emotional, physical drain, not just on the families, but on our communities. And that's a big problem here. So rare diseases are defined by the National Institutes of Health as a medical condition that affects less than 200,000 people. Some of these disorders are so rare that they affect maybe only 10 or 12 worldwide. I mean, that's what we know right now. It's probably more than that, because several of them are undiagnosed. But the impact overall is just huge. I mean, you see it in your own family. I have a 27-year-old and who wasn't supposed to survive her 3rd birthday. It's a miracle she's lived this long, but it's taken a whole community to get us this far, but it does take a huge drain. And we have problems with access to services, insurance coverage, all those issues that affect us. So that's one of the reasons why we hold this legislative breakfast on the last day in February. And we explain to the legislature how they can help us with laws and access to services.
Yeah, Dominic, you mentioned that there's a range of the degree to which these diseases affect people's lives, and that's true. But on the whole, these diseases tend to be serious and lifelong. About 80% of them have a genetic component, and they tend to be the kinds of diseases that really do require services and many special needs for the families. So it's very, very important to be going to our state legislatures, and at NORD we're also doing a lot of work around education for Rare Disease Day, hosting and helping organize events in schools and universities and medical schools around the country.
Now, how was NORD founded? I mean, I guess you guys have been around for how many years now?
Since 1983, and our website, I'll give a little plug.
Plug away.
Rarediseases.org. And NORD actually was founded mostly by patients and parents of patients who were involved in disease-specific organizations like the Huntington's Disease Society and the Marfan Foundation, and they, essentially the problem at that time was that almost no treatments were being developed for these diseases because it's very expensive to do the research and go through the process of bringing a new drug to market. And if you have a very small patient population, you just can't recover that investment. So it just wasn't happening. So the leaders of some of these disease-specific organizations got together, and they figured that if they spoke together, even though each one individually was rare, together they're strong. In fact, that's NORD's motto: alone we are rare, together we're strong. So they worked together to get a certain law passed by Congress, and it's called the Orphan Drug Act. It was passed by Congress and signed by President Reagan in 1983, and it's widely considered to be a very successful piece of legislation. Since that law was passed, there have been more than 500 treatments approved by the FDA for rare diseases, and in the decade before the law, there were only 10 brought to market.
So I know, because I'm an NPR junkie, obviously. So I get to learn so much from NPR, because they brought up and they discussed the Orphan Drug Act, and how it gives benefits to pharmaceutical companies by making procedures less costly and easier. But like you said, when you think of a medication that comes out, people don't really get a full grasp of how much money goes into research for these drug companies. And I know sometimes they get a bad reputation. There are certainly bad actors within this,
yes.
But to be able to bring something to actually development and through all the trials and everything else costs millions.
It's a very long and expensive process, and it's always kind of a balancing act. The FDA is considered the gold standard worldwide. That's the Food and Drug Administration, and they're the ones who review the new products that companies are developing. I'm old enough to remember the pictures of the thalidomide babies in the newspapers, and in fact at that time FDA was holding firm against approval of the product that was a problem there. So, you know, I think we, as consumers and patients and parents, we want to have products developed that we can have reasonable expectation are going to be safe and effective.
Sure.
So we want a really good process in place. On the other hand, you know, we want to have access to these treatments afterwards. So it needs to be a good balance between companies being able to recover their investment and, you know, not being excessive in their costs.
And a lot of these newer medications are all, we're coming out with a lot of genetic or biologics, which are very, very expensive just to produce. And one of our big problems is that these are expensive drugs. They're going to a small market, so of course the costs are going to be high. And it's not the same as what we're seeing with some of the other pharmaceuticals, such as, well, with the
I'll say the
anaphylaxis.
nice ones with
Yes.
with the
Yeah.
EpiPens
The
of the
EpiPens.
world, and
I know,
some of
I
the
tried
other
it.
ones.
Were they-
I'm not worried about.
Well, it's not
my
the same
exposure to
situation.
anything,
These
yeah.
are just
Yes.
expensive drugs to produce, and they're very small markets, and we have to keep these companies in
Well,
going.
the other factor in that is, and this is obviously the biggest part of this, is I think the number's some 40% of medical dollars spent on children go to
Well,
our
that's-
population.
Well, that's where we start getting into.
Yeah.
When we start, what was it, about 10 years ago, I think, with Eurotas when they started founding Rare Disease Day.
In 2008
Yeah,
was the first
at
year.
that point, the Europeans and over here in the United States, NIH had realized rare disease was becoming a public health issue. We're a population that costs a lot. A lot of our disorders start in childhood and they become progressive, they're debilitating, and they're lifelong. So it's managing these patients. We end up being in the hospital frequently, not because we're not following medication routines or doing what we're told. There are no medications for us. Or we're using drugs off-label and there's not enough information. There's approximately 500 approved, FDA-approved medications for rare diseases. There's 7,000 rare diseases.
Yeah.
So a lot of our patients don't have help. And that's why we end up in that. And so it's trying to manage this, trying to get more drug development in this population, trying to find ways to help us with services, better diagnosis, better management. And that's what we're working on with a lot of this. You want to talk about how Rare Disease Day came about?
Rare Disease Day, sure. So Lesley mentioned Eurordis, that's the European Organization for Rare Diseases. It's sort of the European equivalent to NORD. And NORD, in fact, NORD's founders helped establish Eurordis several years ago. But in 2008, they got the wonderful idea that there should be one day a year, at least, that we all kind of work together to focus attention on rare diseases, especially for educational and advocacy purposes. So the first one took place in Europe in 2008 and was successful. So then they came to NORD and asked if we would bring it to the U.S. And we did. And in 2009, Rare Disease Day was observed for the first time in the United States. NORD hosts the national website for Rare Disease Day at rarediseaseday.us. And there are now, I think, something like 90 countries around the world where Rare Disease Day is observed. Each one has an organizing group. NORD serves as the sponsor in the U.S., and we all get together beginning in the summer before Rare Disease Day, which the day itself is always on the last day of February, and we talk about what should be our messaging for this year, what do we want to emphasize. And for this year, worldwide, the theme is research and the importance of research.
And I know research obviously has changed. I know Lesley's been long-term in this. I'm a newcomer to this.
I know my background.
But some things have, throughout my life have certainly fascinated me. And I've always thought, when they started the Human Genome Project of mapping DNA, that they were going to find so much information out, and I think maybe the misnomer within that is I think it's helped with diagnosing, but I think there's so much information that's out there that it's still
Well,
evolving.
You're right. It has produced a tremendous amount of information. The problem is we aren't quite there yet in interpreting it all,
Yes.
knowing what it all means and applying it. And we run into problems. My background is in hematology oncology research. I started out in laboratory research, worked for Red Cross and a number of other organizations. Around the time that my son and daughter were born, I was part of a PhD program looking basically for disease markers. So I've always been at the forefront, and so I do understand this. My daughter was probably lucky because I did have a background in this, and so I knew a lot of people. But as we go forward, it's difficult. We have to also wait for a lot of the hospitals and the whole system to catch up. There's a lot of things that are developing now that are right at the forefront, but we're not quite ready for them. And this year we're talking about research at the State House, and we have researchers from Yale, UConn, from pharmaceutical companies like Alexion, and we have patients talking about what's happening. And a lot of our research ends up being funded by patient organizations. That's a big thing. A lot of states and stuff don't spend a lot of money on it, the federal government and stuff. There are NIH grants, but that only goes so far. So we find a lot of patient organizations spend a lot of money on research. One of the groups that's going to be speaking at this year's event is the Glycogen Storage Disease program, the new Glycogen Storage Disease program at Connecticut Children's. And that there is a group in the CURE GSD, which has raised funding for research, and then there's a group, well, it's Alyssa's fund, and I can't remember the name of the new organization they founded, that ended up raising money through things like she runs a big wheel derby every year. And they've raised money for glycogen storage disease to help patients, and then they raised enough money to bring the researcher from the University of Florida up here to Connecticut. And he's working on a genetic therapy for these children.
You know, that's such an important theme. So much of the research on rare diseases is funded initially by patients and patient organizations. At NORD, we have probably at any given time more than 100 disease-specific research funds that are started by either by individuals or by patient groups. And when they raise enough money to fund a grant, we'll put out a request for proposals. I actually was on a teleconference yesterday with our medical advisory committee where they were reviewing research proposals. And these are, the medical advisory committee are MDs at medical schools and university campuses around the country who volunteer their time to make this possible. And it can be pretty time-consuming for them. And they really take it seriously. They're trying to, and these grants are international, they're competitive. We want to fund the very best research we can. And in many cases, these small seed grants provided by, and sometimes they're not so small. Some of these patient groups really are very active in fundraising for research. But a lot of these studies result in articles published in journals and identifications of genes and that sort of thing that can lead to other important research or to bigger grants from government agencies or ultimately pharmaceutical companies.
It's nice to hear that it starts really, and this is where I understand it, at the grassroots level. That, and I know I see things like, I know around in our area we've heard of Eva's Miracle.
Oh, right.
And I know I have a friend over in Milford, Erica Funk, who does, her son has, oh God, I can't remember. He's got a very rare skin disease, and it's very painful. And yes, that's it. You got it. And she does fundraising. I know my wife, is trying to organize 5K runs for the disorder that my son has, fatty oxidation disorder. So it's nice to see that when you go out and you participate in these things, I think people see, oh, okay, well, you know, it's nice we raised money. Well, what does the money do? And you can see it's you know, it's a seed.
Yeah.
It's a seed, but it doesn't grow into a flower unless you have some of the other ingredients and you put it in the right soil to be able to make it grow, and you hope to, you know, flower out and be able to help other people in the community.
Yeah, we know of at least 2 cases where products that started with very small seed grants from NORD ultimately led to products to treatments approved by the Food and Drug Administration. One of them is a medical device, the titanium rib, for children who are born with actually a number of conditions that result in there not being enough room as the child grows for their lungs to expand. And I recall that when our founder retired a few years ago, the researcher who had been desperately trying to get funding for that, couldn't find it from any of the usual sources, got a grant from NORD, and then the research was promising, and that led to a grant from FDA and ultimately to an approved product. He came to our founder's retirement party and presented her with a scrapbook with pictures of 300 children whose lives had been saved by this device. And it starts with a $30,000 grant, which is nothing in the world of medical research, but those things can lead to really good things.
And I think that's the thing. I mean, some things are simple, some things are diet, and you know, it's a matter of getting these children diagnosed early, which is why the newborn screening program is so important to us. And it's seeing a child who hasn't been diagnosed and what happens long term going on, and then seeing a child who has. Last year when we presented this, we had a young man with tyrosinemia, and he was picked up. There's testing for it. There's been testing around for a long time, but there's a newer test that picks up a more rare form. He was actually picked up in that early on, and it just amazed the legislature. We had to coax him to get up and talk to them, and he kept going, well, I'm afraid. And we kept going, no, you don't understand. They just want to hear you speak. They want to see that you're a normal 14-year-old boy. And when he finally got up there and realized what it was, and I said, and he goes, I realize how lucky I am. I was diagnosed early. I've seen others who haven't been.
And I think that's where you talk about being a genetic component, that a lot of these things, you know, they are dealing with children.
Yeah.
And I mean, newborn screenings, I can speak personally, you know, from them that, you know, if my son wasn't diagnosed off the newborn screenings, you know, I mean, we got the call that said you got to make sure this kid eats every 3 hours. We didn't completely understand it, and it was all too confusing within that point. But if we didn't, we would have come to a point where we said, okay, well, you know, we're okay to let him sleep through the night, and being, you know, new parents who are pretty exhausted at some point in time, you would have, you know, gone to sleep, and then he might not have survived through the night. And I think, you know, there's a lot of children out there that we probably may have had a rare disease of some sort that get blamed, you know, with sudden infant death syndrome.
Right.
And I know my son, for that instance, could have been one of those kids that, and then it would have just gone away as being unexplained. And, you know, I think, I know from my community, the fatty oxidation disorder, I mean, obviously, my son doesn't process fat for the people out there. So you and I can go for long periods of time, and what your liver will do is your liver will break down, you know, these long HC-like fats down into smaller pieces, and then, you know, eventually into energy that the body can process. So with him, if he doesn't eat, he can have, you know, severe problems, or he can die from it.
Early diagnosis can be so important with many of these diseases. I'm just sitting here thinking the two of you are planning this event in Connecticut, and there are others all around the country in other states planning events also. And one of the mothers whom I know who will be speaking at the event in the state of Virginia has 2 children, one of whom was born with a genetic condition that nobody knew about. The parents just thought were told that he was a lethargic baby, and then he ended up having a medical crisis and now is compromised for life, will need very expensive medical care all his life. But just about the time this was happening, the mother found out she was pregnant with another child, and that child actually was diagnosed with the same condition before birth, so that from the moment of birth, they were able to provide appropriate care for that child. And so this mother will bring the two children with her, and one is a healthy, happy little girl, young girl with, a great future ahead of her, and the other is this son who could have been the same but will not be.
So how many different disorders or genetic diseases do we have, like, for screening in Connecticut right at the moment?
Oh boy,
I'm not
I'm
sure.
not exactly
to be honest.
sure. I will get that number before I'll get it for you later. But the RUSP is what, 57 diseases, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah, that are detected for newborn screening. In order to do it in states, there has to be a test that's relatively inexpensive, and then there has to be some sort of treatment that can take place right at birth and will make a difference. So right now we have, I believe it's 57 or 58 tests. We don't do all of them here in Connecticut. We do about 88% of them, and that's one of the big pushes that we're pushing for. We would like to be at 100%. There are other new tests and disorders that now have treatments. I think Lexion has one that's LAL, lipase.
Acid.
Lipase. I can't remember the name, and believe me, you don't want me pronouncing half of them anyway. I'm terrible at it. But there's a new one that they have developed a treatment for, and then SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, is another one where there's a treatment now available for some of them, but not all. But those can be tested for at birth. So those are things that are not even on the RUSP yet. The RUSP is something that's developed by the Centers for Disease Control. And they're the ones that keep all the data on it. They're the ones that add the tests. So a lot of times you have to go and have a test added. Here in Connecticut, one of our speakers would be Jean Kelly. Her son, Brian, has adrenoleukodystrophy. And she was one of the ones who pushed very strongly to have ADL added to the list. There is a treatment, stem cell transplants, I believe, that can be done. Her son was not treated early enough for it to help, but there are other children that have been. So it's dramatic to see the change.
See, now who pays for the newborn screening? Because
that's where we get into
that's usually the bone of contention.
It is the bone of contention, and it's one of the arguments I will have, like with the legislature and insurers. It becomes it's the hospitals. The legislature adds new tests by law to the RUSP. That's why it is. And what happens is the insurers and the hospitals will come, they'll argue about the tests, it's too expensive. But from our point of view, it's not too expensive. When you take a look at one child, and then you look at the lifelong cost of caring for that child on the state, it's a no-brainer. It's so much cheaper to go through and do these newborn screening tests right from the get-go. Jean will come through, and she's talking about adrenoleukodystrophy. This year, I believe they detected somewhere between 5 and 7 more children than they predicted. So there's 5 to 7 more lives that are saved. It's not just the lives that are saved, it's the cost to the state of the long-term care. And that's what we have to look at.
Well, I know, I certainly understand.
Oh, I know you do.
Because I deal with a lot of the different waiver programs, and I mean, for brain injury, I mean, if you're at the worst level of it, I mean, your cost of care can be $200,000 to $300,000 per year. And I know through the DDS, because a lot of these kids, they end up, in the developmentally disabled system, which accounts for probably about 5% of our total budget, or close to $1 billion. Very easily, and a lot of them get put in there, even though might not be developmentally disabled, because they have neurological disorders.
Severe. A lot of these kids end up with severe neurologic impairments, and once the damage is done, if they don't get treated early, once the damage is done, it can't be reversed. the best you can hope is to slow it down. But a lot of these disorders start in childhood. They're debilitating, and they're progressive. So it's just a slow. And so for years, I mean, my daughter's 27. She cannot walk or talk. She's bedridden, but she enjoys life. She laughs at TV. She laughs at us. She acts. I mean, she can't talk, but she makes noises and interacts with us. But it's the long-term costs for her. Last year, we had several crises that weren't predicted. She wound up in the hospital 7 times, and we're talking about $500,000 in bills. So those are the costs.
Yes.
And if we had been able to get her diagnosed early and better treatments for her, we could have avoided all that. So I do know a lot about the costs that we face, and I see it. I work with a lot of parents. I've been through a lot with her. I know the difficulties we have with insurance issues. Last year we ended up having a battle with the insurer not wanting to cover my daughter because she's 27. And they tried to tell me, well, she's 27, she can't be on your insurance.
Because it stops after 26.
That's what they were saying. Unfortunately, Connecticut and the state of California, where my husband's company was located, are both states that have continuous coverage for adult disabled children. So she is on our insurance forever. So it wasn't just to the state. We had private insurance for her. But it's very difficult to get coverage for these children. It's very difficult to get a lot of medications covered because we're using them off-label. And all of the newer medications for friends who have children with hemophilia or the bleeding disorders, those are all specialty tier. Our drugs come out, they're expensive, and they're automatically thrown into specialty tier. So we're not just paying regular out-of-pocket cost, we're paying a copay and a co-insurance. And that co-insurance doesn't always count against the insurance caps. So we have families going broke.
And I think, when I look at this in the bigger picture, and this is obviously a major issue right at the moment when you talk about, Obamacare or the the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. It did a lot of things that I don't think people understand. It took away lifetime limits.
Yes.
So in many cases, you had a $3 million cap on funds that the insurance would pay out. You could hit that in 5 or 6 years pretty easily, and then what's going to end up happening is because you've exhausted those funds, you're going to be coming back to the state.
Yeah,
and it's going to go to Medicare or Medicaid. So, I mean, you can cost shift it any which way you want.
And I mean, it can also remove pre-existing conditions. Sure. It helped us in a lot of ways. Last year, when one of the fathers of a hemophiliac testified at the State House, the legislature never forgot his opening line, "I hate Christmas every year." And the reason he hated Christmas every year was that he had 2 sons who were in college, so it was, college tuition costs due January 1st. And then in the first 2 weeks of January, he would make that $12,500 payment for the cap. And then it was all the co-insurance payments on top of that. He said it would take until almost June to start digging out from the debt. And he and his wife worked for an insurance company. He had his own, and they were, successful middle-class families, but they had trouble making it. And that's what we see, a lot of what we see. But in any event, ACA did help a lot of us. Even with the cap at least controlled some of the costs. And that's what the father said. It did help in that respect. Otherwise, they were just out of control.
I'd be in a situation where my son would never be able to get insurance.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
At the time the Affordable Care Act was being debated originally, I think NORD's position was that we didn't align ourselves with any particular plan, but there were just certain issues that we felt needed to be included, and one was elimination of discrimination based on pre-existing conditions and elimination of annual and lifetime insurance caps. And then just to have a system where there was some affordable insurance option for everyone. Well, because we had a lot of people at that time who were contacting us who, especially because of pre-existing conditions, just couldn't.
I was advocating with another group at that time, and we went down to Washington when the ACA was in front of the court. And I can remember going into several of the legislative offices down in Washington, and I had an argument with one of our representatives. You're never supposed to argue with a U.S. congressman, but I had just watched all the insurers walk out, and I can remember walking in saying, the one issue that's so important to us is pre-existing conditions. And I remember him standing there, oh, nobody wants that. And I remember screaming at him, oh, the insurers who just walked out?
Yeah.
He stood there and he goes, well, Lesley, and I said, your daughter, and I happen to know him your daughter has a pre-existing condition. And all of a sudden he stopped and he looked at me and he's like, what do you mean? She was an asthmatic. And I said, you don't understand. It's a pre-existing condition, and it can eliminate her from insurance later on. So at that point, it was like, oh, I said, there are hidden disabilities, and there's a lot of us with like rare disabilities, and we really need this. I said, we affect 10% of the population. And so at that point, he starts, reviewing it, and he goes, okay. Well, it ended up being a moot point when the court came through and decided in favor of ACA. But it's a huge issue to all of us, and it's something that we just really end up fighting for, and we're fighting for it now on a state level to ensure that we have these coverages too.
I know we talked about the newborn screenings. I know for each person that goes through this, or each family that goes through it, I want to say there's almost like a diagnostic journey that we all kind of face within that. And I know your daughter's.
She's an exception. So.
Undiagnosed. I know mine got diagnosed
early, right?
At early, and we were able to have the genetic testing. But there's a lot of people out there.
Well, you had the experience with your son.
There are many undiagnosed people, and we hear from them frequently at NORD. And I think there have been a couple of studies in recent years showing that it takes, on average, from 5 to 7 years, I believe, to get an accurate diagnosis with a rare disease. And I know, and many people go much longer than that, or never get one.
Yeah.
I just personally can recall some occasions when we've posted questions on NORD's social media, on Facebook, and I remember posting a question once saying, how long did it take you or your loved one to get a diagnosis? And just the responses started to pour in, and very passionate, and just stories of, decades of searching, or sometimes people are kind of pigeonholed by family members, or even sadly by their medical care providers as, just having that it's in your mind, or you're seeking.
It's getting psychiatric diagnosis for a lot of these patients. So the big problem is there's just so few physicians who have ever seen them. There's only 6,000 geneticists, I think, in the United States, and most of them are elderly, which is a problem.
Yes.
But there's so there's less than one geneticist per disorder. And a lot of these, the big problem is there's 7,000 disorders. They have symptoms all over the place. But worse than that is the variation in symptoms from two patients who have the same disorder. One may be mildly affected, one may be severely affected and totally debilitated. So it's that variation that makes it difficult. We're getting better. A lot of the data crunching, I think, that's what you're going to be seeing in the future. I think we've got several of the really leading data crunchers are starting to go through all that genetic information that we're getting and starting to make sense of it. But it's still very difficult for a lot of these patients.
And I can understand for families, and this is one of the reasons why I want to do this show is because for families who might have questions about things, they can call up your organization and kind of go through like a list of some of the issues that they might be facing, and you could probably give them direction.
Right, or they can come to the website, rarediseases.org, and we provide a lot of information there. We have databases they can search to see if there's an organization or a support group for their disease, or to read about the diseases. And also, going back to our conversation about the patient protections and protections, so that things like The protection for pre-existing conditions won't go away, and whatever changes may be coming to the Affordable Care Act, we're encouraging people to share their stories with us, and there's a place on our website where they can do that. So,
And that really helps. The more stories we get out about.
to be able, we have a team based in Washington, D.C., who spend all of their time working on those types of issues, and for them to be able to really articulate the experiences that the patients and their families are having is so helpful.
Well, I know I do, and this is part of what I call like my mission in life
Your passion.
Yeah, is, I strange as it may seem, I live my life out loud for what I deal with for my son, and I connect up with so many legislators because I want them to know, okay, here are the issues that people face, and it's more than just a little chunk of, oh, here's my life. No, they hear, and I put it out to them, and I interact with a lot of them to let them know when my son's gone into the hospital, and some of the issues that we've had with the educational system. When he first went into school, through needing to have nurses follow him at certain points, and some of the strange things that have happened to us in our journey along the way. I try to live that out loud so that other people can be able to see that, and that in hopes that a lot of the times that legislators have constituents that might have similar issues.
And that's so important, and it really is helpful. I think sometimes people think, oh, they won't listen, or it won't really make a difference, but members of Congress at the national level, and then the state representatives at the state level, really do want to represent people well, and they need to know about the problems and the challenges.
Well, as we discuss our stories, I mean, yes, my daughter's undiagnosed, but she's classified as a patient with an inborn error of metabolism. We know that. She's been seen by the world's leading experts. We just don't have a specific name for it. And so a lot of undiagnosed patients have areas where they can go. So that's why it helps going to a lot of these support groups. I do end up interacting with the fatty acid oxidation disorder people, because all inborn errors of metabolism have fatty acid dysfunction. So your groups have helped me tremendously figuring out ways to manage my daughter's diet. So these groups all help us, but it's as we learn from each other, we're learning a lot more, and we're helping the medical community understand our needs a lot better. But despite the fact that there's 7,000 different disorders, we have common challenges, and that's why we come to the state every year. School issues are one of them. They're a huge issue. All of our disorders are different, and it's the schools at a certain point want to keep us out, but we or an organization or even a physician need to come in and teach them about our child's specific disorder so that there aren't problems like you had with Mikey.
Yeah, and after the mistake was made on the first day.
First day of school.
He went into school. They didn't follow up to see that he ate lunch, and he went into crisis and ended up, in the hospital. They were certainly more amenable and understanding, and I was actually fortunate that their head doctor for our school system was familiar with this, and he'd actually treated somebody with this. So he understood what the issues were, and what we were able to discuss with them were, instead of waiting till the last 3 days before they start up school to put a 504 plan together, that we need to be able to identify these people well in advance. They need to have a plan come together where they're flagged for him, so that we can make sure that their entry into school or the change, because when children change from elementary school to middle school to high school, it's a challenge for all of us that have a lot of these disorders, because now you got a whole new group of people to educate. But I know you told me that there's actually, through Connecticut's Department of Public Health, they have educators that come into
Some,
schools?
some of them do, but not all for all rare disorders. They do education on a lot of things like asthma and some of the other things, but they do on some rare disorders, and they can, if approached, a local public health department can work with you on that. So that's one way to go in, and it's ways that some school systems have used. We've had, someone from the Narcolepsy Foundation was telling me that they have produced a video to help the schools, and they send that in with their patients, because what they were running into is that the children would be diagnosed with narcolepsy. They would go into school, and then the next thing they're being approached by the school psychologist that the child has behavioral problems. And it's not a behavioral problem, it's a genetic disorder.
Yeah.
And so we would, these children would be sent off, or they would be put in a special school because they had behavioral problems. So that's why they ended up developing their own system. And it's one way that we can do it. There's a lot of ways, but it's some of the parents I know, when my daughter was born, one of the physicians recommended that I bring in a file with her. And in my daughter's case, she was the first student, I think, in Stanford to have an individualized healthcare plan written into her IEP. And so what I would do is I would hand it to the nurse, and then I would also hand it to the principal. And it would have articles about children with disorders like her. She had secondary disorders like severe food allergies because she couldn't metabolize food, things like that. So it was educating them, but the problem I had was I had my daughter's food allergist, when he had developed a training program for schools, send one of the first programs to the school. We sent it to the principal. He didn't know what to do with it.
No.
I had to go and scream at them over it. And after they went through the training program, then that became the designated school for all children with severe food allergies in the state, or the city. So, I mean, those are things that we have to be very proactive on education, but it's also working with the school. I was lucky I had friends on the school board who told me what to do and everything else.
Well, I think
So-
anytime you have anything that you're going to be interfacing with your city, I think it's always important to go seek out the fire departments, the emergency medical staff.
Yep.
If your
Everybody,
child's
yeah.
going into education,
School
to
system.
the school system, the superintendent. I know Mikey knows the mayor, because God knows I think he wants to be one at the right time, because he'll talk on the
helps.
floor. But you have to make those connections, and on
do.
the state
And to
level.
work collaboratively.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a lot of times it's just a matter of educating,
Yeah.
about the disease and the situation.
And I know it's hard for parents. I know, and while we've talked about it, a lot of times you're never prepared to have a child born
Nope.
with a difference.
Yeah.
But when it's so rare that no one knows what it is, it becomes even more difficult. And what happens is usually one parent stays at home, or the parents adjust their schedule so that somebody's always with that child, and it becomes difficult. But if you can find a few minutes, you have to get out and actively involved in your community and in the state, because that's where you're going to get the services. You have to talk to your state legislators and talk about things that are important to you, because that's what they're there for. When we go to the State House, we used to initially talk about our diagnostic journey, and a couple of years ago I went and talked to the legislators, and they said, it's wonderful that you come and talk about your diagnostic journey. It pulls at our heartstring, it raises awareness of rare diseases, but the problem is you're not telling us what we can do for you legislatively. So in the last few years, we've been focusing on showing them what our legislative needs are. And that, we get some pushback, but a lot of us all have the same education, or the same needs, the education needs, the insurance needs. We need a voice, and one of the things we're pushing for this year is a Rare Disease Advisory Council. 2 years ago, they addressed it. They gave us a task force, which hasn't met yet. It's going to meet in another week or so. But we're pushing more for an advisory council to advise the Connecticut General Assembly about laws, and then just services through other state agencies that we need. And I know you're pushing very hard for it.
Yeah. I like to say I've been doing this for about the last 3.5, 4 years.
Yeah, you have. You've been actively involved.
On a very active level, and I usually try to pick one or two things that are important to me or my community that I try to focus in on, and certainly this is actually how we got to know Lesley, NORD, and all the other parts, because I didn't personally know all the interacting pieces. We knew about a piece of legislation that was put forward, and I think part of the problem was that because there were different groups that were going at it from different ends. I know they took a Massachusetts bill and tried to bring it and make it for Connecticut, and it didn't match exactly. And I know the major issue that we had with it, where there's no geneticists
Oh, yeah.
on you know, this advisory council.
Well, each state's different, and
Yeah.
that's one of the problems we run into. So, well, NORD, a couple years ago, after I and several other started leaning on you all to form state coalitions, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to form a coalition. When you and Julie Gortz and several of the others went in to form, from the Mito group went in, you weren't aware of the fact that we have a rare disease community here that's not just parents and advocates, it's also researchers, it's legislators, it's the biotech industry, you know, it's academics all over. So it's, and that's what we try to bring together is everybody, because we need everybody's voice. It's even insurers. I mean, I sit on a state practice transformation task force here, and I've talked to insurers, and it's like explaining to them, we don't fit into neat boxes, but if you can work with us, we can help control those costs. And that's the big thing. We've got to all work together to control these healthcare costs.
We do. And for many years, NORD did focus on policy at the national level. And that made sense for many years. But then particularly with the Affordable Care Act, and just as things were shifting so that more decisions were being made within the states, or maybe we were just becoming increasingly aware of that too. So we have worked with people, wonderful volunteers like Lesley in all of the states too.
It's like medical food issues. They vary from state to state. And yes, they did borrow. And it's like Massachusetts were close, but not exactly the same.
They have a stronger public health department.
Each state, the public health department does different things. Some states, the public health departments are very actively involved, and they work very closely with DSS and other agencies. In our state, there's not that close reaction. I know when I sit on this practice transformation task force that I talk about, one of the things we were talking about was integrating community services with the physician groups that we're working in. And everybody's sitting there talking about, well, we can do this, that, and the other thing. And I sat there, and because of my background in laboratory, I know what public health department here in Connecticut does. And I'm like, has anybody talked to public health department? We had members of the Department of Social Services on our, well, no, we never thought of doing that. I'm like, why don't you? They have nurses who go out in the community, they educate about certain diseases like diabetes or asthma, heart disease. They have connections to housing and food, which are all things that we were talking about, and it's a problem. Which
is, like I said, with all the issues that we have, it's its tentacles go off in multiple directions, and I think our hope is to have to be able to advise the legislative body, as well as bring in those agencies like public health and DDS and Department of Social Services, so that we can address, this wide encompassing issues that some are, very common, some might be a little bit more specialized, but the overall effect is we're looking to find ways to make this work better for our community, but also to find cost savings within that, because God knows I don't want to be in a hospital with my kid. If I can find a way to avoid it and have him, be happy, because every time he does go in a hospital, it's like it knocks him down a peg, and it takes a while for his body to recover from this. And I know how debilitating that can be, and how psychologically debilitating it could be for the families, because you're trying everything you can in order to keep this all together.
And when he's at home, one of you has to be there. And
the more we can all work together to address issues proactively and avoid those costly hospitalizations and treatments, it's going to save everyone money in the long run.
I'm amazed at how quick the hour always
I know.
goes.
Before we finish, we should announce that we're having our Rare Disease Day
Right.
legislative breakfast at the Legislative Office Building, 300 Capitol Avenue in Hartford, from 8:30 to 10:30, and everybody's welcome.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. Mary, I can't thank you enough for coming
Thank
here.
you.
Leslie,
Yes.
God knows I know my partner in crime up at the
have been.
legislature. And again, thank you all for watching out on this, and please go to the National Organization for Rare Disease website if you have questions and other follow-up within this. And, we hope to see you up on the 28th of February, because it's an important issue to all of us. So have a good night.
Thank you.